Um, welcome to the Martin School. I'm Steve Cowley. I'm the acting director of the Martin School. This is the first of our lecture series of the year, and our lecture series on great transitions, navigating the 21st century challenges. I'm not going to read out all the titles because it would take time. And we have the most amazing title today, which is Hippos, Tigers, Pancakes and Soufflés, Trends and Challenges for African Governance. The soufflés thing is really, I'm looking forward to finding out how the hell that gets into this, but that's very interesting. We're very lucky to have Stefan Dercon with us, and Stefan is the co-director of the Oxford Martin Programme on African Governance, and I think we will hear a lot about what that programme is going to do in today's lecture. He's a professor of economic policy at the Blavatnik School and a fellow of Jesus College and director of the Centre for the Study of African Economics. And he continues to do work for our government. He's the Chief Economist of DFID, the Department for International Development. So he's a busy man, and we're very lucky to get him here this afternoon. And there is one thing, absolutely officially, I should tell you. You're being watched. You're being filmed. And recorded, and it goes out live. So if you ask a question, you have been informed that you will be beamed around the world, and whatever you say, you better own. Okay, so thank you, Stefan. Thank you very much. Looking forward to your talk.
Okay, well, thank you very much. So I almost want to apologize for the title. What I definitely don't want to do is to, lower the calls by being flippant about some of these things. But, I have a reason for a few of these things. But when I was looking through my presentation, I decided to cut the pancakes out of it, so no pancakes. So you'll have all the other ones in due course. But it's largely to actually describe things and to give, some narrative around it. And in fact, what I want to do in this talk is to, it's not really giving you the deepest possible answers, but I do always find it important that we get a good sense of what is happening in terms of recent patterns and the kind of challenges that at the moment are pervasive. I'm going to focus on sub-Saharan Africa. The title has African governments, the program also has African governance in it, but that's, we are talking about sub-Saharan Africa, and, it's almost like an apology as well if some of you find it could be more precise. I'm going to be generalizing here and there, while I'm totally aware of lots of heterogeneity. Every country, every context, every part of each country is quite different. So, some of you will get a little bit annoyed with that, with the generalization. But look, I'll be happy then to be challenged by you on some of these things. But what I want to do is that actually certain commonalities in some of the policy challenges that these countries are facing in economic terms and in the politics. I am going to not deeply giving the clear answers possible, but towards the end I want to give a bit of a sense what I think are some of these big outstanding questions. They are not the same as saying these are the researchable questions where one of you can start writing a paper on. One of these things with big questions that have to do with policy, you need to break them down in 1,000 little pieces to actually do good science and good research on it. But at the same time, it doesn't matter. It helps, or it should help, a lot of people quite a lot, that to understand where would they fit into the bigger picture. And that's what I try to do, is to give you the bigger picture, not saying this is exactly the next research question that will get you on the road to the Nobel Prize. So let me first do, and I'm going to go quite fast, to give a bit of a sense of some of the progress and challenges. Okay, so I'm going to use a couple of data sources, one of which are these beautiful pictures by our World in Data, Max Roser and friends, here based in Oxford. This is just the most magnificent website. If you never looked at it, do look at it. And they give, for example, in their presentation on some trends in Africa, some really nice and interesting patterns of what's going on. This is 1980, it's infant mortality, it's child mortality. That means the probability that a newborn child will survive will not survive before the age of 5. Okay, and so you get these kind of remarkable figures of 1980, where you have some countries where these figures can go up between 10 and 20% and above that. That is actually kind of remarkably high numbers that we had still. One of the great stories of the recent times is that this has gone down dramatically. You know, if there's one thing that is so striking that's gone down, is anything to do with infant mortality. There are much lower ranges now, where many countries are drifting into this 5 to 10%. That's still a lot, you know, that's a lot of children still dying before their 5th birthday, but at least there is this kind of progress at a kind of a large scale. There's another way of looking at it, and that actually applies to lots of indicators to do with human development, is the progress. So this is actually, and I'll use this a few times, this kind of setup, which is essentially the blue area here gives us the 80% band of where countries are in. Okay, so it gives us a sense of not just of the mean or the median, but also a bit of the distribution. And what you see then is actually, say, on child mortality, these massive declines from on average, the median country having about 150 out of 1,000 children dying before, so 15% dying before the age of 5 in 1980, going down to about 50 as the median. And the band, everything is moving down. It's not just some countries totally staying behind. The progress is actually remarkable. Life expectancy, almost as a result, has been increasing. But also other things like, you know, children that are in school. Yes, we may wonder what they do in school, but at least they're completing school. And these numbers, again, these median numbers are going up. So it also means literacy rates, something like, you know, if you compare generations in African data now, you know, those who are now 65 and older, and I should emphasize, if you get 65 or older in Africa, that is well above your average life expectancy, so that you usually are quite a good, well-off person. If you then compare it with a whole population of people between 15 and 24, that has many more poorer people in it as well. And again, the kind of literacy rates, so from the more towards the red end, is very few people being literate, and the bluer it is, it's one more people being literate. This progress is quite remarkable. It also is in the economy. You know, in the economy, there's been quite a lot of progress in recent times. Per capita GDP in Africa between 1980 and roughly now has gone up by about 60%. Okay, so what we mean that the average was about 1,000 per person. This is in dollars that you can compare over time in constant GDP. And it's now about 1,600. That's 60% increase. And say that's great. This is per capita, taking into account population growth. These are good things. And actually, across the distribution, it's not everywhere. There's heterogeneity, as we had in the previous pictures. So you get some countries where, like Ethiopia, where in this 20-year period, growth has been closer to 6%. In fact, in the last 10 years, growth has been close to 8% in Ethiopia. While in other countries, it's clearly been lagging. You see this color, you see here some countries here, like the Central African Republic, and here Zimbabwe, where actually we had a decline in per capita GDP. So heterogeneity, but there is on average progress, let's at least say, with differences. One thing that's definitely been helpful here, I'm going to be very careful with causalities, is that one thing that people have kind of sometimes forget to mention is that actually underlying macroeconomic management in Africa has improved quite a lot. This is a very simple indicator. This is actually just inflation and the kind of spread of inflation rates that you can see in African countries. And in the 1980s and 90s, you know, you had the bands, these blue-colored bands of 60 and 80% bands that you have here, you know, they were really wide. It's not like one country that always had high inflation. What you saw is that one was then suddenly at the 80% on one end, and then it had zero inflation in another one. There was a huge instability in what was happening in these economies. This is actually really African macroeconomic governance has increased quite dramatically. These bands are relatively limited. They are actually reasonable, average inflation rates of 5% in poor countries that, you know, are faced with lots of shocks and so on in the economies. That's actually quite a striking thing, okay? So by 2040, 9% of countries had inflation under 10% in this particular context. So these are good things. Even, you know, another totally different dimension is what happened to politics. This is again from Wealth in Data, and you could argue about the indicators used, but they're used for those the connoisseurs, the Polity 4 score, where they try to get countries ranked by degrees of autocracy, or democracy and the variations within it, or in between, that actually you get a very simple one, a very red-colored thing here, autocracies in Africa in 1985, most of these countries in that kind of state, where you get much more heterogeneities and quite a lot of countries that we would call democracies spreading in Africa as well. So the kind of progress in political regimes is another striking thing. So, you would forgive people that start to say, Africa rising, this is here, this is going up, this is thing, and this is around 2011, everybody ended up talking like this is the great news of the future, the time, economists having front pages all talking about Africa rising and doing this. You may see the soufflé coming already. Because it doesn't mean this is not without challenges. I want to get one, which is not in itself a big challenge, but it could be a challenge given some of the things we're saying, which is basically people. And it's one of these striking things that people sometimes forget. First of all, Africa is that green. This includes now North Africa as well, in the way the data come from the UN. Actually, Africa has always been rather small relative to the total distribution. There's not that many Africans, put it very simply. There's a lot of Asians, and Asians, that is the vast majority of the world, are Asians. But of course, what you see is that the growth rate of Africans is increasing. So, and this is roughly at our doorstep. By about 1980, African population was maybe about half of it's a bit earlier actually, but about half of the European population. By about 1995, it was about even. We expect that African population by about 2050 will be about 2.5 to 3 times the population of Europe. Gosh, in London, my superiors get a bit worried. Okay, so it raises already this kind of issue, this is a lot of people. So what is that trajectory where we're going to go? And, and a lot of the fear about Africa at the moment has a lot to do with this. Now, I don't want to say that's a real problem, because we don't really talk about the Asian population problem, where this is going up. Although when I started in development, not even started, my very first essay was on Bangladesh. Is Bangladesh a basket case? And basically, it was in 1981, and we had to write, essentially, that was more or less the brief. Kissinger had said that, actually, that Bangladesh was a basket case. And that we actually just had to write an essay, and it was the idea that these Malthusian traps, this country is just growing too fast in population relative to its resources, nothing will come from it. We don't talk about Bangladesh in this spirit anymore, and I'll come back to Bangladesh in a moment. Population itself is never a problem. It's only if your economy can actually sustain it and your society can sustain it. Anyway, this is what's been happening here on the population side. Also, actually, in this kind of growth picture, we should be a bit cautious here. One thing that's clearly happened is the dispersion of progress in Africa. There's a huge spread of some countries getting really dramatically rich in very short periods of time. Gabon is an example. Or you get other countries that actually are more or less stagnant. Malawi is still about $300 per capita, and I think, as long as I can remember, it seemed to be more or less like that. But other countries have clearly been rising. The median is still well below 1,000 in GDP per capita as well. Median country growth rate has been less than 0.5% per year over this period, 1980 to 2015. Okay, so that's pretty low. Okay, now that also leads us a little bit. It's not been that dramatically good, but also it has been in a context of some emerging challenges as well. And now we come to a more recent period. This has stagnated now. Okay. This was a very nice trajectory up, as we were showing earlier, but this is now stagnating. And this is quite interesting. These are terms of trade, how Africa sells to the world relative to what it buys from the world. So basically, there was a period here of very fast rising of the prices of what Africa was selling things of, natural resources, relative to what it was paying to buy things. This has started to collapse, and this has collapsed. This is a bit of the souffle here. This is actually now stagnating, and it actually is here, this is happening. We see growth rates, this is here, actually on average going down quite a lot. So that's a kind of a really tricky period. one of the big worries is that to a large extent, and I will show in a moment it's not entirely, but to a large extent, that growth was actually just largely relative prices. A lot of the recent growth in Africa, GDPs per capita, that seemed to be rising, it was actually just rising on the back of relative price changes that actually doesn't seem to have translated in something that allowed it then to progress upwards. Now, that's the challenge. It may not happen. Maybe, maybe Carlos, you'll think here that this is now, next line is up. It's possible, but it's an interesting period. This is a moment where we need to be very careful of how we think about it. Of course, there's differences here, and that's already the heterogeneity in the story. The differences between the naturally source-rich countries, we've now here done it simply oil versus non-oil, that actually see, this is actually what happened to the oil, and that's where the decline started happening. The non-oil ones, they actually are still on a slower but steady path up. This is the overall GDP per capita. We see that in growth rates, the growth rates of the oil exporters has dramatically collapsed. The others has been going up and down, but it's in still positive levels. You still have to say, of course, it's not very high at the moment. Even in that sense, it's not that dramatic. There's something happening, and let me not give you a macroeconomics lecture, since probably I'm not very good at that. But actually the way these things have been translating, these terms of trade, have been translating is something. This is spending, public government spending. This is actually revenue collapsing. We start getting basically spending gaps, deficits. We get internal and external deficits. They are actually here showing what's been happening as a percentage of GDP. They become deficits now. We start getting two things. Debt begins to rise, and we actually get also inflation risking to start picking up. Very simple thing. Debt, we have to be careful. Some of that debt is in countries, and I know there was, like, for example, last weekend in the FT, a lot of written about it. The IMF been talking about it. We probably need to differentiate here between some countries. Ghana is an example, who went to the market to got a lot of debt on the international market just to pay and increase twice the government salaries. Let's say I wouldn't recommend that, okay, to go and borrow on a 20-year horizon just to pay your civil servants in an election year a bit more. Other countries are doing it to invest in infrastructure. There's some, Ethiopia's been going also to the market. You can ask yourself, can it handle it? But it arguably has to be different. You have to think about it different. And these data will misleadingly not show that. Anyway, and then finally, in terms of the challenge, so, we start getting macroeconomic challenges as well. We also getting challenges of conflict, However you use data around fragility, this is data that actually in DFID is being used. As far as I know, it's not always made public, but, this is just one way of dealing with this, is to actually weighing somehow states that have capabilities to deliver to their citizens, legitimacy of the state, and the underlying stresses in that state, both from natural resources and conflict, and actually make an index of that. And if you get red, it's pretty bad. Okay, and if you're gray, then there's actually nothing there really in the data to tell you, except for a couple of places that you don't have the data. But you can see, maybe not in population in the world, but definitely in the number of countries and the areas, that's a big blot of red countries. And being a red country is already bad. Being a neighbor of a red country is also not very helpful. There's a lot of countries here where you get these spillovers and the whole thing. And that's another part of it. Challenges in Africa. And that means, actually, I think the combination of, the growth that has been there but maybe not been that dramatically positive, and at the same time the fragility probably goes a long way here, and that is, of course, the two are quite related, goes a long way to actually say, well, in the world terms, Africa has been staying behind. This is a simple way to actually say, is Africa and other continents, parts of the world, are they converging to the rest of the world? Their GDPs per capita, are they slowly getting close to where the OECD is in per capita terms? This is as a percentage of OECD. Yeah, Latin America had a pretty bad period. It's been recovering. It's, again, natural resource, so quite a lot of commodity price linked, a bit more stagnant. But anyway, it's been recovering a bit. Look at East Asia, of course, driven by China. It's beginning to converge. For the first time since the 18th century, you probably have a landmass that actually is beginning to converge to where actually OECD, or at least Western countries, are. So this is very striking. South Asia is beginning to do it, India rising, but very slowly. You know, let's be a bit slow. That's only still 10% of GDP per capita of the rest of the OECD. Africa, it's flat. You know, it is not there. It is the group of countries that clearly, on average, stay behind. Again, with heterogeneity. I'm always interested, what does it mean for the poorest? Well, this is the global story on poverty. This is about 1980. This is where the poor are. We use this measure that the World Bank likes to use, is to somehow find a way of having a benchmark. It's not perfect, but in a way that you can compare between countries. About $2 per day per person, but it's a benchmark that you can compare between countries. On that benchmark, working backwards, around 1984, we had about 2 billion people. You know, more than 1 billion were in Asia. If you took, at that moment in time, a poor person out of the hat, and you were to check what their passport is, the odds would have been, this would have been a Chinese citizen. Okay? This changed here in this period. You see here actually, this blue is actually not really increasing, but it's not really going down in this period. It's increasing a little bit. That's South Asia. By this period, around 2000, if you were to go and check the passport, you probably will find an Indian passport in terms of the odds. That's changed now. This is still the case, actually. If you take a random poor person, most likely the country with most poor people, in other words, is India. But this is now changing, and it's now close to, we think now roughly, where it will start shifting. In any case, South Asian poverty has gone down, East Asian poverty even faster, Sub-Saharan Africa. In percentage terms, it's going down, the population is growing fast. It's stagnant around 400 million. It's been like that since 2000. There's not much movement. Okay? So that's where we have it now. It's across a lot of countries. In some countries, note the red color again. It's very similar to the red color we have. Poverty is increasingly concentrated in Africa, also in these very fragile, conflict-affected countries. But there's still a lot of everywhere else. The colors are definitely darker still in Africa than anywhere else in the world of any size. If we then project these patterns, then the nature of the change that's taking place finally here is to actually say, well, all people think, if we start saying what's been happening in recent times in South Asia, we actually think this is going down. In fact, the best projections, whether it's the World Bank or Brookings or our people in DFID, when they do their projections, we actually think that roughly, well, we're now about 10.7% in 2013, the best data we have. Poverty in the world will go down to 5%. They will be virtually all African. The Asian poverty problem, the extreme Asian poverty problem is disappearing. It's Africa. Now, that's the challenge. This is where things are getting a bit stuck. Is it really rising? It was rising maybe for a bit, but this is the soufflé. Okay, this is the right is actually a soufflé I made. Not a very good one. It collapses quickly. And it's not quite there. So there's these challenges. You know, it's interesting times, okay? So this is also something that I think is really, you ask yourself, you know, what is happening with that adjustment? This is a real crucial moment almost in recent history for Africa. You know, after rising this, going on this increasing wave, now it's coming down here. What is it going to do? Is it actually taking this as an opportunity to diversify, to adjust? Even on the basic macro. You know, the kind of problems we had in the 1980s with macroeconomic adjustment. I'm not saying they're going to come, and many countries are doing sensible things. There's definitely a couple, and there I mentioned Nigeria, are being very tricky. You know, they're not willing to adjust their economies. Unfortunately, suddenly, what you earn from the world is about half than it used to be. Somewhere you need to adjust. Find a way of your economies. Similarly, the natural, non-natural resource rich, can it really be this kind of things? And then where will the jobs come from? Because actually even this fast growth in that period, 60% increase in GDP per capita, still 400 million poor people. So it's not quite necessarily happening. And then we have, of course, still dismal projections, including with the fragility side. Now, I want to say there are exceptions. You know, there are really interesting cases, and actually are some of the studies we want to do in coming years on African governance, that there are interesting places. You know, definitely in the past, Botswana was the big example. The only natural resource-rich country that actually fundamentally managed this reasonably well in an African context and actually turned it into its big advantage. Ghana has been at times doing really well, has been a bit, probably is doing right okay. East Africa, Ethiopia is seeing very fast growth rates. Tanzania has been growing the last 10 years at about 6 to 7%. Ethiopia has been growing now for about 13 years at above 7%. You know, these are substantial growth rates. This is possibly happening. Actually, I read somewhere, and you know, these projections you always take with a pinch of salt, but Ethiopia may well be the fastest growing economy next year. Okay, so you get kind of interesting things. They are exceptions. And I want to actually talk in the next about it. You know, what can we learn from other contexts about how to turn this around? But secondly, also, you know, some of the challenge we have in the underlying political economy to actually do so much about it. And that's basically what I want to focus for the rest of the talk on. So if you ask yourself, you know, what have we learned about it? Because, you know, I showed you things like East Asia there, even South Asia. They are beginning to improve quite a lot. And in fact, you know, if you look at Asia, there's exceptions there. But overall, there's been really, really fast growth. You know, Burma or Myanmar, which we would worry often about for very important reasons now at the moment, but also in terms of, oh, this wasn't doing too well. It wasn't doing too well while growing for 10 years at 6% per year. You know, these economies were growing and growing actually remarkably fast, and even living standards were improving, maybe not fast enough, but things are happening. The economic action in Africa is still relatively limited number of pockets. So there have been lots of successes, you know, but I want to actually ask the questions, you know, what have we learned about that? You know, quite an interesting source here, which is actually worth writing. So about 2007, a growth commission from the World Bank was set up. Michael Spence, Nobel Prize winner, you know, very much a microeconomist, sees his calling. He needs to do something for the common good, a bit like Jean Tirole recently does. You know, we need to start, we win a Nobel Prize, let's actually do big picture things. It's great. So Michael Spence very effectively led a commission and actually tried to write a report. And they had a really kind of a very useful line for any of us in this kind of world of trying to think through development trajectories, which was a very simple one, is saying, look, don't ask us what the recipe for successful growth is. We know some of the ingredients, but we don't know the recipe. Okay, and some of these ingredients, they list. It's quite nice to read this. And basically, you know, I can give you first a tautology. Success, and they define success as a country that can do for 25 years at least 7% growth. Yeah? Success, and there's been 13 success stories up to then, success means somehow they are managing to have a growth process that actually absorbs people into the growth process, poorer groups via labor absorption into better high productivity jobs and activities. How do you do that? Something to do with macroeconomic stability. There's something to do with getting investment going and domestic and international investment, one way or another, public and private. Typically not closing yourself up from the world, and something to do, you know, the private sector plays a role. This is less, it's not about, oh, it must be one model or another. They definitely don't do this. Similarly, they say it has to do something with social sectors, you know, and basic health delivery, education, something security and basic protection of the poorest. These are tautologies almost. You know, surely that's what success looks like. That's an economy that grows, that actually creates jobs, that has social sectors that function, and so on. What is quite interesting, although they write a bit about it, it rarely gets emphasized, is some of these other factors that clearly they're sometimes forgotten. Especially a lot of the people who wrote about the East Asian miracle, they seem to always a little bit forget that. They were arguing about this is the economic policies that you did. I think there's three factors that are quite crucial why, for example, East Asia could have been quite successful, which actually makes it, and what actually makes you ask questions around the African context. And these three things are essentially necessary utensils. You can have your recipes, but if you don't have these utensils, it's very hard to cook the dish. And the first thing is simply, you know, conflict. You know, stability, a peaceful country is actually quite a necessary thing to actually get some serious growth to sustain for a long period of time. It may be simple, but in a world where you are dealing with a lot of countries that are inherently deep with conflict, we can't ignore that. And it includes probably a state that has a monopoly of violence in the barbarian sense, but somehow that, you know, whatever it is, there needs to be that. That's the minimum condition. Two more are also very important and not always satisfied. That's actually having some extent an effective state. And I will later on qualify this as calling it like a sufficiently effective state. This is not like the perfect state that functions like in the Chinese example, everything functions and they can take anything on and they do it. But something there that functions in a way that actually growth and social sector systems and development basically to foster. Okay, so we'll talk about it in a moment. But the one I'll talk most about is actually this. And that's actually something really striking. That's an underlying political economy point. It is really, when you start looking at across East Asian countries, somehow you were talking about an elite that actually was fundamentally committed that actually there should be growth and in most places also poverty reduction. There should be success in the economy. It mattered. It mattered politically, it mattered for the elite, there was a shared interest in it. There's somehow, political settlement that somehow suggests that actually that should happen. That's quite a striking thing, because it's not so easily obtained. In fact, if you go back in history, in fact, even present day, you can't think of any government, trying to go to elections that doesn't try to say, this matters for me. We take this for granted. Oh, surely, every government takes this for granted. In what follows, I will not take this for granted. I don't think that actually, in quite a lot of places on the continent, just as historically in quite lots of places in Europe and including in the UK, we couldn't have taken this for granted, where elite interests were not aligned with actually the interests of actually getting growth and maybe poverty reduction as well. So it's important here, this is not about have a state that takes a leading role in it. Okay, this is not about a state that leads in the economy. This is actually a state that basically, where the elite interests that underlie the state are consistent with growth and development. So this is not about market versus state. You travel often in Africa and you get these debates, sometimes also senior officials and leaders. They want to say, no, we believe the state needs to lead, or we believe the private sector needs to lead. I think that is secondary here. The underlying commitment is actually quite important. But then you have to ask yourself, what is the state for? And what is the state in this particular context? So when you go around in Africa, I'm afraid the animals are coming, you have there's a lot of images of the state. And so the one thing that I was struck with, traveling and talking to lots of finance ministers and economic development ministers and people, leaders in countries, is how often people claimed, we want to be tigers. Tiger economies like the East Asian. We want to be tigers. We're going to be the next tigers. And I don't know, at some point occurred to me, of course, there are no tigers in Africa. There are no tigers in Africa. There are lots of other animals. And the first time I actually talked about it was actually in the DRC. It was in front of an audience that consisted of loads of MPs. They all had lots of time, clearly, lots of officials, lots of ministers, and they all wanted to, basically, the brief was, tell us how can we be a tiger. So, slightly flippantly, but also slightly cross with some of the things that are happening in that place, for me, it's actually, they're not tiger, but a tigerfish. Tigerfish is an interesting fish here. And for me, that's the image a bit of the predatory state. If you look up on Wikipedia what a tigerfish does, it swims in the Congo River and the Zambezi River. That's very common there. It also has very sharp teeth, and its only purpose in evolution seems to be eating little fish. Okay, I'm not trying to say that DRC is necessarily in it, but definitely, my reading of history, Mobutu was definitely the master of being the tiger, operating a predatory state. It's what we call a predatory state, where basically it's about fundamentally the state, the function of the state is to steal for those who have interest in the state. And Mobutu Seseko, remember him, he had also great lines. And for example, he had this speech at some point, he said there is the article 15 of the Constitution, and basically said, débrouillez-vous, fetch for yourself. So there's basically get what you can. There's 14 articles in the Constitution. So he basically, like the 15th one, that's what you should be doing. And he gave a speech once in front of civil servants. He's like, citizens, I know that you have to steal, but if you need to steal, if you must steal, then steal a little and leave the rest behind for others. And this was a kind of climate we had. We can have a deeper analysis of it, but that was definitely, as if there was a predatory state. I'm not saying that it always was a predatory state, but it definitely had the language and the description of it. But even now, I was spending time in DRC and looking at actually how the state gets organized. It's very striking. You know, if you want to export coffee from Matadi, which is the harbor in the west, you need 57 signatures and 7 stamps. Now, you're not going to tell me that you do need these for food and for health and safety or for something important. And as you know, as many of you have traveled, you know, a moment of contact with an official who wants to be corrupt is the moment to actually, you know, get money stopped. If you get stopped on the road in some of the countries where police may be corrupt, then that's the moment. This is basically the system. We were traveling on the Congo River, and we were just struck there were no ships anymore that carried merchandise. Well, basically, the predation had gone so far with needing 17 permissions that were so expensive that it was not profitable anymore to move any goods anymore on the river. Now, okay, so that's today. Okay, that's today, and that's really striking. Okay, there was another thing, a classic meeting at some point, the Minister of Finance, IMF in their wisdom had said basically we need to get more domestic resource mobilization. Look, I'm a big fan of countries trying to pay for their own development. That creates good incentives. DRC introduced VAT. In the first year, the amount of VAT that was repaid was larger than the one that's collected. Now, let's briefly think about it. How does VAT work? Is that, you know, for certain things, you can actually claim back because it's higher up the value chain, someone will pay the full amount. If the repayments are higher than what you actually collect, that either the collectors are putting the money in their pockets or receipts are being printed, and it was the latter. Receipts were being printed and money was given back. The Ministry of Finance was losing money on VAT, which is very difficult to do. It was quite a scheme. So anyway, so I have this. I'm not going to say, but there's some of them, and I need to keep an eye on the time. There's also failing states. You know, this is actually, and that's unfortunate, there are some, you know, where basically it's all about scavenging economies. For me, it's very much these kind of places. I spent time in South Sudan in recent times. You know, it's deeply depressing, okay? So where you actually see where fundamentally a state has moved from being predatory and just basically all about the distribution of the loot, the oil revenue, just in a period of less than, it's less than 6 years, to turn into actually conflict again and fighting, where fundamentally it is all about, you know, trying to keep the scraps. Oil production is collapsing. It's still fighting, actually, as far as I can see, a political economy lens would suggest, at the moment, given that oil prices are low, this is not a good moment to do a deal because there's not enough to go around. So basically, the incentives for conflict perpetuation are there to continue. I'm not saying it's the only thing, but it makes me very depressed. It was a very depressing place because what's left, still, even there's still the oil revenue, those in control will take it. Government tries to reduce the loot of the ones in the rebel-held territory. The only mechanism that it can't tax anymore, it can't steal anymore because it doesn't control the territory. What can it do? It can print money. It can inflate the economy so that the money is not worth much. And it can collect the inflation tax as well. That's what it's doing as well. What does it leave for people? Very little. Anyway, look, these are the exceptions, I will say. These are the two types, they are the exceptions. They're exceptions. There are two classes probably there, and that are worth briefly mentioning. The first one is, and actually Ricardo Soares de Oliveira with Harry Verhoeven at some point wrote very good about it, very carefully about. These are essentially the illiberal state builders. This is a class of countries that where actually, you can say there's genuine leadership interested in state building and development. They are the countries where you can really say there's a clear identification with a commitment for development and growth. Often though, they're quite illiberal. So you get this, some people will call it, I don't use that term, developmental authoritarianism. Other people say these are developmental states. These are the kind of states that are based on it. They're quite interesting. For me, these are the lions. They're not the tigers. They're none of that. These are roaring lions. A bit scary at times. They have often emerged from victory in conflict, stable with the monopoly of violence, more or less. Yeah, more or less, you know, you could classify maybe in a broad category, at least on this characteristic, the Angolas, the Rwandas, the Ethiopias on it. But not all of them, I would say the latter two probably more, actually really subscribe to development ideology, which goes beyond simply redistributing for your group. Okay, that's contentious, but that's, I think, in my analysis, still of these two places. That's contentious for many, because they would say they still want to redistribute just for their groups that they represent. I still think, fundamentally, it's not there. With strong structures, strong leaders, quite effective in delivery of development. You know, these are the countries that are fundamentally committed to development. In fact, what I would say, their legitimacy is based on development. They represent minorities, typically, but they're actually trying to the development is part of gaining legitimacy across the whole population. Okay, so take the Rwandas, Ethiopias, huge process in development indicators, and that's across the board. You know, people will argue about it, but that's not simply for the ethnic groups that they may represent. And it's really kind of a commitment. It's legitimacy-seeking governments, but they're quite illiberal. They're quite easy for agencies like the one I'm Chief Economist of to work with, because they're committed to development. They have no other objective. They're very clear to it, and you can actually work with them. So it's a real, all kinds of issues, legitimacy seeking to development, no question of their authority. So in one of the things that we want to study in our program as well is actually some of these kind of cases. What do they do when they actually set out to do it, and what's the political economy of some of these things here? But the others, and I would say the vast number, and I'm coming closer, this is the last typology, the vast number of countries are actually probably more what could be classified as, you know, patrimonial states. Weber had this category. States that actually are designed to redistribute. If you are in power, you distribute to the groups of people that you represent, that you are the patron of, or that actually you owe money to or resources to because they brought you to power. So these are the redistributive states with resources to followers for loyalty. I think it's still very prevalent. This is not about saying, oh, this is in Africa. In loads of parts of the world, versions of this will still exist. Actually, you could even argue in Europe, and even in this country, there's elements of this as well. It's to do with the nature then of the checks and balances and the underlying how we obtain the resources to distribute, okay? So, but what we have in many countries then is this kind of mix of modern and patrimonial personalized. You know, look at Zimbabwe, where you get this kind of very modern state, but very personalized allegiances. You go to many other countries that you could go to where actually you get these things. You get layers of informality, layers with formal structures. The state looks all very modern, but actually underlying there's a lot going on in relationship. But the fundamental thing, if redistribution is your objective and not development, then actually you really have problems here, because it's a bit like, you know, sometimes describe African politics in these countries, like is a ship not seeking to go anywhere, but simply staying afloat. Your ambition is not so much to get further in long-term development and even taking sacrifice today for longer-term things, but it's just keep yourself in the position you're in. And so this is why I use the hippo for that. You know, this is the hippo is actually, you know, this is a big animal. When you see it in the water, it's floating a little bit aimlessly. It looks totally innocent. Often you see only the hippo ears. There's a lot of African languages, and I've been told in South Africa, but also in Sierra Leone, local languages talk about the tip of the iceberg, actually the hippo ears. We only see the hippo ears. We only see that bit of the state. It all looks pretty normal. And as you know, it's the mammal that kills more people in Africa than anything else. And it's actually a pretty dangerous one as well. But the important thing is, and it makes it really hard to work with, because actually fundamentally that's not about change, it's consolidation. A lot of these countries went for third terms type of thing. They went for just consolidation of power, whatever. Everything becomes an instrument to keep this position. And it doesn't mean that it's all bad, but there's a relative reproduction of dysfunctionality. They're not effective states, but marginal improvements as possible. And I know I run out of time a little bit here. I'm close to the end here. So if you allow me just a few things on this here, because there's a few things that you then notice. If you want to do economic development, well, in these states, typically, the state and the businesses, that's all a little bit mixed together. This is not like a nice division. This is the private sector that has its own competition committees that needs, or policies that needs to deal with it. And then we have the state that surely has to be very careful. It all gets a bit mixed, you know. There's issues there at times on procurement. There's issues to do at times on corruption. I'm not saying these countries are fundamentally corrupt and can't be changed, but it's part of that patrimonial system where you can thrive on connections, little favors of a bit of trade policy here, a bit of control, a bit of a new tax on something, and another rule, an input subsidy, and so on, and so on. The main thing is here, it's very hard to enter. These economies have struggled to be dynamic. Because if it's all to do with connections, how do you enter? And this is actually one of the, to that extent, one of these dramas, actually, of that new innovation and new business entering is actually makes it really hard. So it's slow, they can have progress. These countries have not done badly, many of them. Some of them drifted in predatory behavior, and then they do really badly. Others, they are quite okay. Uganda is an example. Patrimonial state, some pretty amazing, impressive things. Even as a donor in aid, you can work with them, because you have pockets of excellence. For example, Museveni understands that if the economy doesn't grow, how will he pay off his parliamentarians for this next term that he wants to stay in power? The price of staying in power is quantified. It's in the newspaper. You know exactly how much he had to pay to be allowed to have a third term. And indeed, for now, the constitutional change, the price will be determined. That's patrimonial politics. But you need to have taxes and tax revenue for doing this. So actually, businesses are, relatively speaking, left alone, relatively speaking. You do very careful things. The oil revenue, you can either be totally predatory, as in some countries, like in South Sudan, you say, oh, just grab it and it'll let it go down. Actually, the best civil servants worked when they discovered oil on trying to get the oil deals done properly with the businesses. I know that one of them is a British company, was complaining that they were too competent, essentially. That they were asking for really a very careful kind of things. They had the Chinese, Total, and Tullow working. They were forced them to work together and then forced them to be in competition. These were the best civil servants, because that's important. If you want the systems keep on going, you better make sure that the revenue doesn't get wasted on frivolous things like other things, direct corruption. Let me use it for the real purpose, patrimonial politics, and so can keep on going, and so on. So this is then the final thing here. And I've emphasized already, this goes beyond, this is the market or the state. My sense is, and you could disagree with some of the analysis, if we don't understand some of these political economy incentives, we will not understand how actually change can happen in these economies. Countries can overcome this, and that's what I want to do as the very final content point. And I always think, like people say, well, look at East Asia. I also will say, look at Bangladesh. You know, there was a basket case in the first instance. It's also a country we know that's can be violent and shutdowns, politics is very corrupt, all these things. But actually, it has achieved dramatic growth for close to 20 years of more than 6%. And it actually has reduced poverty dramatically. And the way it partly did this is being very sensible. Actually, the state knew that it wasn't really going to be able to run the economy fully. So actually, garment industry was allowed to rise. In the 1980s, a Korean firm came, copying was allowed, new investment came, and actually the whole garment industry emerged. It's one of the big pillars of the success. It's also one of the big pillars of female empowerment and reduction in poverty for girls. Similarly, they were terrible at giving social services. Now, in most countries, they say, oh, well, no one else can give the social services. You know, we should be the one that has a legitimate right to give all the education and health, no private operators or whatever. They more or less outsourced this to a set of local NGOs, especially BRAC. BRAC was running social sectors in Bangladesh forever, and really effectively, often with foreign aid in it, and doing this. Yeah, I need to... But these things in an African context would be very hard. Natural resources are definitely a pain for it. Why would you bother trying to grow the economy and why to do anything if your patrimonial or predatory politics can simply be driven by natural resources? So, you know, there's things we can do, and let me not say too much about leads for question, but it's that last quote I want to have here, is that, you know, what's important not to get this perfect state trying to be China, trying to be Vietnam, as we often hear. But actually, I think the next step in an African context would be, is actually that states would be mature enough to take on what it can take on. I don't know what it will look like. In different countries, it will look differently. this is asking especially, it's only Africans in the end that will get the developmental state to work in the way that it helps that the patrimonial politics to turn much more focused on growth and poverty reduction. So what's next? I'm going to just here giving you the kind of 5 things that I think, questions that I really think that are coming up in a big picture. That's the last slide. Of course, it's about conflict. It's also about asking ourselves that, and the second question is something we definitely want to look in more in it. You know, is it going to be different? Is the opportunity going to be taken of low commodity prices? You know, Uganda is a great example. Because these best civil servants were actually slow in getting all the deals out, they're not pumping oil yet, as far as I know. That's really good for the low prices. It's still kept in stock. Will they take the opportunity to think very carefully what they will do with the revenue and actually invest it properly, rather than everybody say we have to have the bonanza of the high prices? There's time now for these countries. Nigeria, meanwhile, is praying, literally almost praying for a return. So it does economic policies that are only consistent with much higher prices. 11 exchange rates, for example, and things like that, ruining your macroeconomic stability. It's another thing, of course, will the new players change things? Well, they will. People all think it's all about, you know, China's giving aid or not. It's actually not. It's basically, African governments have an option now. They can go to, they can still ask for aid. They can go to the Eurobond market, to borrow basically sovereign lending. Or they can actually now go to China, those also have liquidity and also borrow from them. Will they use that choice well? And how will that actually happen? And then it's the countries like Ethiopia who are investing very determinedly in industrialization. Can they do it? And the final thing, what is that future for these legitimacy-seeking governments that actually say development can give me legitimacy? These liberal states that can do it. At the same time, the other side, what's the future for democracies that actually fundamentally still are in patrimonial politics? Will you get basically voters demanding delivery of something rather than just patrimonial politics and redistribution, and actually wanting development? These 4 last questions are questions we want to look at in this program as well. And maybe in a couple of years we come back and tell you more about it. Thank you.
We have time for questions, and Stefan is going to handle who gets to ask a question.
Yes.
So.
I kind of forgot. Thank you, Steve. Well, Carlos and here in front, let's take these first 3, and then we'll go slowly to other parts. Yeah.
Thank you, Stefan. I really enjoyed your presentation. I wanted to bring you back a bit on the narrative that you started with, because the data is the real problem. As we know, only 12 countries in Africa have their national accounts up to date.
Right, okay.
Which means that all the figures that you have are projected on the basis of underestimation of GDP. Because there is underestimation of GDP, everything else more or less is shaken. Also, in terms of demographics, we have a major difficulty because normally we use demographics to consider Africa as having a problem when in fact the world is aging very fast. And we are going to witness a youth bulge that has not been happening in the same terms as other regions before,
Yes.
because of the aging. And as a result, there are dimensions that we have to bear in mind that are going to completely change the picture.
Okay.
And that creates a lot of fluidity in the narrative.
Yeah.
Because let's take your example of DRC, just to pick one. Until 3 years ago, it was growing at 8%. Inflation has gone from 3,000% to about 10% in just 1 decade. So we can say lots of good things about DRC. And yet, comparatively, it's not doing very well. And it's full of political problems. So that is just one more element that is going to make your job very difficult.
And yours as well. Rana.
I'm going to take you in the other direction. So with the categories of states that you described, there's a couple of them that seem like equilibrium, like the neo-patrimonial state and the tiger fish. And then there are two which seem like they're not in equilibria. So the illiberal state builders and the South Sudan type, because something is going to change. Like what happens when the illiberal state builders actually develop state legitimacy? What happens with the South Sudan types when the money really does become so small that they can't realistically? No. So what's next?
Thank you for an easy question. Yes.
Thank you so much. My name is Abraham Makoy. I come from South Sudan. I thought your presentation was very, very good, and I do quite appreciate the role of effectiveness of the state or the elites in how they undermine state building or how they can actually enhance economic growth as well as poverty reduction. And I think if you were to analyze what happened in South Sudan, you would correctly describe through these two as opposed to the loot. Because as you know very well, the oil production was shut down in 2012 until somehow in October 2013, and the war actually broke out in December 2013. So the role of the loot itself did not contribute significantly
Take your point.
to the conflict. But the lack of political will by the elite to carry out with the state building, I think it contributed in a very big way. My question is separate from, I just want to appreciate what you had to say, but it seemed like you have quite a very strong opinion in most of these African countries. How does this opinion of yours influence the way DFID either play or contribute to the continent? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, yeah, let me quickly. Okay, so I take the point on the data. Although we could argue for long because these are data that don't exist in a sense. We're missing them. There's rebasing problems. There's evaluation problems. The big problem arises then is also when we do these I forgot the right term, but basically this recalculation of GDP, rebasing of GDP, a type of exercises. Working backwards is then a really difficult problem. Right? So we may have to make then very strong assumptions about what the patterns backward are as well. Is this a similarly flat line and simply goes up, or is this an upward line, or indeed something else as well? And it's one of these things. My own judgment is that we've always done better off. This is judgment. This is not necessarily true, and we could argue about. My own judgment is that we probably have dealt better with growth than actually we've dealt better with the base itself. Okay, but we can argue about that because at least some of the rebasing exercise in Ghana and Nigeria made me suggest we probably didn't. The underestimation of growth was probably not affecting the kind of the recent judgment. We could argue about it because these rebasing bringing new kind of activities and things in. The demographics, no, I'm totally with you. I was trying to be very careful. I said, it scares people in London when they see these numbers. It used to scare people about Bangladesh, that, how can this ever be a Malthusian? This was before migration scares as well, that these numbers are. I'm always very careful because, we know, and Hans Rosling has this beautiful picture is that basically show how virtually everywhere in the world there was this very fast over 30, 40-year period back to more or less 2.3 or 2 fertility rates in terms of number of children per woman going down to 2 from numbers that were 7, 8 as well. In Africa, it's been going slower. And that's the only thing. It takes a bit of time. And we know also that what causes this thing. This is nothing to do with family planning per se, but it's with other things. But we know also that this will be potentially the opportunity. The biggest risk is, and that's where there still is a risk, is that the absorption of the demographic dividend can't be taken for granted. There has to be a demand for jobs, there has to be a demand for activity. Simply saying that the fact that we have so many young people will force or cause the dynamism of the economy that they will be absorbed, I wouldn't necessarily buy, and we could have an argument on that. But it's an important point, and I take it entirely. Okay, your point about the equilibrium ones. No, that's very right. I mean, the problem with conflict-affected states is that this is one statistic that Paul Collier at one point brought out, is that the best predictor of a fragile state is having been, of a conflict-affected state is having had conflict in the past. There is state dependence in that as well. That may not be an equilibrium, but it doesn't help. It's still a form of a trap, as he would have argued. So you have to be really careful that actually it's getting out. Interesting that the developmental state, that you would call it a disequilibrium as well. I would argue that that's not necessarily how we think about it in the Asian context, or maybe we do. Asimoglu Robinson would argue this is a disequilibrium. The China will fall, but we don't know when, so to speak. The kind of state that is set up in that particular way. Let me say, probably the horizons are longer than actually the kind of dynamism of conflict-affected states. They will keep on quicker go back into that state. But yeah, so I take your point, and it's a good one. I mean, it does remind me of the kind of models and thinking about equilibrium political outcomes, or even, thinking on the South Sudan then to also, Alex de Waal and the way he would write about the way, new equilibrium may be obtained. These are bargain equilibrium where there's entry and then people basically are political entrepreneurs out to loot and then try to actually get into powers. But let's not go there. On the South Sudan, this is an interesting thing, and you're absolutely, of course, right. I would argue, though, that when President Kiir closed down the production in 2012, this was actually trying to get more loot. That was actually the incentives there, and it actually triggered probably other things as well. But I take your point, is that in the periods before, the incentives were, and that's where we then do agree, I think, the incentives were not there for an elite that actually was committed to seriously build the state. One of the striking things in South Sudan is that basically government left the entire social sectors essentially to the aid agencies, which they did and said, oh, we'll do that. But in all contexts, that's the bad idea, If you basically have no responsibility as a state to do it, you have no capacity building in the state to take it on, and everything is parallel. And so that is reflected in that commitment, that political commitment. Finally, shaping different opinion. Well, there's at least some people here in the room that have lots of different experience. I will say these things, I will talk about these things. When you are working in an international aid organization, you have to keep the long term in mind here. Just having strong opinions and impulsive ways of reacting is not going to help anyone. So if there's anything that I would want to argue is that the influence of, I may have strong opinions, but at least the underlying analysis that I do think that we will do aid much better globally and from DFID as well, if we keep this political economy dimension in mind. That this is not just us doing good towards someone else, thinking that is politically neutral. Our giving of aid, in the example of South Sudan, us giving beautiful social sector systems in education and health away from the state, in a state that doesn't really care, is a political act. And it has long-term consequences as well. So I would say, that political economy analysis is essential to it. And I would dare to say that quite a few people are trying to keep that in mind. But the things there as well. Okay, more questions. We can talk more about it. Thank you.
Good evening. My question is about what your opinion is on intra-African trade. So trade between African countries. We have a situation now where a lot of African countries are still trading with their former colonial powers. And do you think that there'll be a growing trend in African countries trading with each other?
Yeah.
And the influence that may have on economic growth?
Okay, good. Take a few more.
So my question was essentially the dichotomy that you pointed out between the recipe and the ingredients of growth and development. So the European growth or the Western growth in general and development has generally been in a completely different period of time, which has been very conducive to the kind of development that happens there. Is it even possible for African development to happen with the present economic structure, which entrenches a certain kind of inequality towards countries that are already not economically developed? For instance, say the financial system and the lots of debts that created the famines during 2008, or like the political support that is given by Western countries to African, not to African, but Middle Eastern dictators, so on and so forth. So will that, thank you.
Okay, I'll take a second. Thank you.
Thank you. Joseph is my name. It's good you have described actually the typologies of Africa, but I'm wondering of the way how our neighbors are treating others. For example, look at Congo is a neighbor to Uganda, a neighbor to Central African Republic. You have Ethiopia, neighbor in Somalia. You have Botswana, Zimbabwe. So these neighbors, as you see them, some of them are progressing, some of them are not progressing. Now, look at the question of NEPAD. You have NEPAD for African, okay? Now, you have African Union. You have all these economic blocks. COMESA, you say East African Community, you have all these blocks are there. But imagine within the blocks, some of these people are actually have bad governance. Some of them have good governance. So how do you compare? How do you deal with that kind of situation whereby you have one person is bad, so another person is good, and they're in the same category? So I'm asking myself a question: if these leaders go to the African Union, for example, to meet, what actually they discuss about? Because by virtue of you having different identities in terms of leadership, good governance, bad governance, what exactly do you discuss about development? It seems that even our leaders actually don't actually question themselves. Because if someone is from South Sudan, for example, say South Sudan should become part of the East African community. Now, Rwanda is saying, for me, I'm stable. Kenya is saying, I'm liberal. Tanzania is saying, you can't take my land. Uganda is saying, I want to be a leader. So within the group, people have different ideologies. Right. So how do you harmonize that?
Right. So okay, good.
Sorry, got one more and then that's...
Oh, that's it. Okay. Then.
Thank you very much. I don't think I heard during the talk a mention of the environmental challenges that are facing the continent now and the problems they pose for governance. A list which includes but is not limited to food security, infrastructure delivery, migration, water scarcity, etc. How do you respond to those challenges?
Okay, good. I'm going to start with the last one. You know, as far as I knew, I didn't have 6 hours to elaborate on all the things. But a more serious point is actually of course these things are important. There's a lot to do also with time frames here. You know, at one level, you know, some parts of the environmental challenge in Africa have also to do with governance. Okay, of course, another part has to do with climate change. Okay, so there are things from external forces and internal. The governance things and the kind of, you know, different countries clearly, you know, those where there's a higher degree of commitment to growth and poverty reduction, you know, in the longer term, they also tend to try to do more sensible things there as well. And so I would say that the climate change threat is one of these other disruptors, okay? My reading of it, and, you know, again, reasonable people can disagree, my reading of it would be, you know, the kind of mean changes that we often emphasize, the mean changes in agriculture productivity and so on, they have a couple of decades to run before they start really biting. Yeah? The early one that we're already having is the extreme events. You know, the droughts and the floods and the whole thing. That at least my reading of the evidence would be that you know, how extreme the extreme events are is already likely to be increasing. Okay? These are these disruptors. You know, we know, Alex Waller just published a book on famines. We know that kind of more natural-based events, natural hazards, they're probably not going to cause famine anymore. You know, I've been working myself on issues to do with that. We can probably handle that, and many countries, even not terribly well-governed ones, can handle that. The problem arises that these environmental challenges start happening in these very fragile, conflict-affected places, and then it's an absolute disaster. And then you have, again, like the droughts in Somalia, it becomes much harder to deal with, the localized droughts in pockets of Sudan, South Sudan, and so on. And they are there. they're part of these disruptors. So I didn't want to say it's irrelevant, but I think they're there. So some really big and good question. I'm going to try to some extent, I think they're linked. You know, my view definitely would be is that irrespective of the fact that this is maybe not, how to say, in the same way Africa's time in terms of its opportunities as East Asia had in terms of opportunities within the global cycle of globalization and access to trade, the times are different. So it's tougher, no doubt. But even within that, I think they can do far better. You know, I don't think it's a legitimate excuse to actually simply saying, oh, well, but the system is biased against us, how can we do anything? And that links to what the other person has said, is that actually there is huge heterogeneity. There are countries that are actually doing reasonably well. I mean, East Africa in its differences, you know, quite patrimonial setups to some extent. They're doing quite a bit better than some other states than Nigeria has been handling its resources. So, you know, there's definitely differences there. And so I would say it can't be an excuse. And it leads me actually in terms of what I didn't spend time on it, but if you ask me, you know, where will the change have to come from? It will have to come from kind of, call it rebooted NEPA type of things. Peer review systems, shaming of each other. We know it didn't quite work in the way we thought it would work, and it can be formalized, can be internalized, and it becomes a talking shop sometimes too much and may not have that same bite. But in the end, I strongly believe that on the continent, if certain countries are started doing better, then actually others will not particularly like it. I bet that Nigeria will not like if Ghana manages to do well, okay? They will not like that at all. They don't like, I know from talking at some point to, name the names, but like the person in charge in government of the economic team, talking to this person, asking me, and how did Ethiopia do it? You know, if Nigerians are starting to ask how does Ethiopia do it, then I think, good. In fact, even in South Africa, a senior ANC official asked me, tell me about Ethiopia. How do they do that industrialization? How do they get the investment? I like it. And I think actually, this is in fact not spending time on it, but what's happening in Ethiopia, I don't think of these states can look like Ethiopia. They have no histories of centralized state like Ethiopia. But my God, can they shame other countries in actually doing something? And we may get some of that. I don't necessarily believe, I can be wrong here, that the institutions of Africa in itself will be doing it. It's still a country very much of nations that try to get on with each other. However, we have examples that where it's happening. East African community is very striking. There was a question on trade and interregional trade. Okay, all these things will start mattering. But it's very interesting that in Southern Africa, the political economy, basically, it's all in the end about protection and about keeping your own stakes in it. While in East Africa, they have been liberalizing the East African community. Yes, Kenya gets quite a big part of the cake. Tanzania doesn't really like it. But actually, in the end, everybody sees it's in mutual benefit. It's that kind of mutual benefit of doing these things that we start seeing. But that's, again, African countries finding a way within their own politics, within their own systems, finding ways of getting economic governance better. And I think the East African community is, within African context, an amazing success in that sense, that actually it has achieved certain things. I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming, and we have to thank Stefan for a marvelous lecture and a very stimulating set of questions from the audience, so thank you very much for that. And thank you for coming to the Martin School. Let's give the speaker another round of applause.